The fighter didn't know he had chosen Chuck Norris. A karate master challenged a random man in a Texas bar, Fort Worth, Texas, May 14th, 1982. A Thursday evening, 9:47 p.m. The air outside the Lone Star Tavern on Camp Bowie Boulevard smelled like rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. That particular Texas pressure, thick and electric, that comes before a late spring storm rolls down from the panhandle and reminds everyone in the county that the land here doesn't negotiate. The neon lone. Starbeer sign in the window had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody had fixed it. The bartender, a retired pipe fitter named Harold Krebs, who had tended bar there since 1971, said the flickering didn't bother him. He said it gave the place character. What it actually gave the place was a strobing amber light that fell across the bar stools and made everyone inside look slightly haunted, slightly older than they were, slightly like a version of themselves they hadn't yet become. The tavern itself was not remarkable. It had a pool table in the back left corner with a torn felt surface that had been patched with green electrical tape 3 different times. It had a jukebox that still played 8-track cartridges because Harold Krebs had bought it in 1974 and saw no compelling reason to replace something that worked. It had 12 bar stools, 7 booths along the wall, and a mounted longhorn skull above the bar that Harold's father had put up in 1963 and that Harold had never taken down, not because he particularly liked it, but because taking it down would mean acknowledging that time had passed and things had changed, and Harold Krebs was not a man who acknowledged things easily. There were 2 ceiling fans, both running. There was a restroom in the back that smelled like pine cleaner and sincerity. On this particular Thursday in May 1982, the Lone Star Tavern held 11 customers. 8 of them were regulars. Oil field workers, retired schoolteacher named Francis, who came in every Thursday for a gin and tonic and never spoke to anyone, 2 brothers who ran a small trucking company out of Basel, and a Vietnam veteran named Carl Boudreau who sat at the far end of the bar and nursed his Lone Star like a man tending a garden. Carl Boudreau deserves a sentence. He had been coming to the Lone Star Tavern since 1975 when he returned from 14 months in a VA facility in Temple to the small rental house on the west side of Fort Worth where he had grown up and where his mother still lived. He was 41 years old. He had been a sergeant in the 196th Infantry Brigade and had served 2 tours, and whatever the 2 tours had taken from him, and there was evidence in the careful, deliberate way he sat and moved and spoke that they had taken considerable things, had been replaced in part by an economy of manner, a reduction of noise, that people who did not know his history sometimes mistook for coldness, and that people who knew it understood as the measured precision of a man who had learned that some things, once spent, could not be recovered, and should therefore not be spent carelessly. He noticed the man in the flannel shirt before Rick Dillard did. He noticed him with a peripheral alertness that combat veterans carry permanently, and that only those who have also carried it fully understand. He did not speak to the man. He did not speak to most people in the bar. He drank his beer and watched with the patient, unattached attention of someone who has been watching human behavior for a long time and has arrived at a settled relationship with what it usually reveals. When the exchange between Rick Dillard and the man in the flannel shirt developed, when Rick made his proposal and the quiet man got off the bar stool and they both went out the back door with Danny Voss following, Carl Boudreau continued to face his beer. But the quality of his stillness changed slightly in the way that a room changes when a sound stops, the absence of something becoming its own kind of presence. He was listening to what was happening in the alley, though the alley was too far and too muffled for specific sounds to carry. He was attending to the shape of the silence. When the 3 men came back in, Chuck first, then Rick and Danny after a brief interval, Carl glanced at them once. He looked at Rick Dillard with the specific attention of a man assessing something, then looked back at his beer. He said nothing. He had nothing to say. But his expression for the remaining 20 minutes he sat at the bar before finishing his beer and leaving carried a very faint quality that Harold Krebs, who had known Carl Boudreau for 7 years of Thursday evenings, would have identified as something adjacent to satisfaction. The expression of someone who has watched something they recognized from a private and necessary distance. The other 3 were not regulars. 2 of them were together, visitors from Abilene, as it turned out, in town for a weekend of business and recreation that had started earlier than expected. The 3rd sat alone at the middle of the bar, a man of 42 in a flannel shirt and jeans and boots that had seen actual work, with a glass of iced tea in front of him, and a posture so still it looked like patience itself had taken a human shape and sat down to wait for something. The man's name was Carlos Ray Norris. Almost nobody in that bar would have known that. Almost nobody would have known, looking at him, the quiet in the way he held himself, the economy of his movements, the way his eyes moved around the room in a slow, methodical sweep that wasn't nervous and wasn't aggressive, but was simply awake, the way an animal in the wild is awake, cataloging without alarm, that they were sitting 12 feet away from the 6-time undefeated professional karate. Association World Middleweight Champion. Almost nobody would have known that this man, who had ordered iced tea and not beer, who had said please and thank you to Harold Krebs and meant both of them, had spent the last 3 years starring in action films that played in drive-in theaters across the South and Southwest, to audiences who screamed and stomped their feet at the right moments. Almost nobody would have known that he had trained with and befriended Bruce Lee, that he had sparred with Joe Louis and Bob Wall and Steve Sanders, that he had stood in front of thousands of people in tournament rings across America and moved in ways that made other men, other highly trained, genuinely dangerous men, take involuntary steps backward. Almost nobody would have known. Rick Dillard did not know. Richard Eugene Dillard was 31 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, and 187 pounds of sincere, dedicated, genuinely accomplished martial artist who had made one significant and ultimately consequential error that evening. He had walked into the Lone Star Tavern already certain about something. Certainty, in the martial arts, is the most dangerous state a man can inhabit. Not because it makes him careless, Rick Dillard was not careless, but because it closes the aperture through which new information enters. A certain man sees what confirms him. Everything else is noise. Rick had driven up from Abilene that morning with his training partner, a younger man named Danny Voss, who had been his student for 4 years and who idolized him in the way that young men idolize the first person who shows them what they are capable of becoming. Danny was 24, quick and eager, and still in the phase of his martial arts development where he wanted to prove things in public. Rick was past that phase, or believed himself to be, but he carried something that functioned like proof-seeking anyway, something that looked from a distance like confidence, but was, in its deeper chambers, more complex. Rick Dillard had grown up in Abilene, the second of 4 sons of a cattle broker named George Dillard, who had measured everything in the world, his sons, his cattle, his neighbors, his standing in the community, in terms of toughness, not cruelty. George Dillard was not a cruel man. But he spoke a dialect of masculinity in which nothing counted unless it had been tested, and in which being tested meant being challenged and not backing down. Rick had started karate at 17 in a strip mall dojo in Abilene run by a Korean instructor named Master Han Sung-wook, who had come to Texas in 1964 and who taught Mu-duk Kwan-tang Sudo with the rigor and seriousness it deserved. Under Master Han, Rick Dillard became genuinely good. Not tournament champion good, not nationally ranked good, but real. The kind of good that comes from thousands of repetitions done correctly, from falling down and getting up so many times that getting up stops being a decision and becomes a reflex. He had won 3 regional tournaments in the late 1970s. He had opened his own dojo in Abilene in 1979, taught 30 students, paid his bills, built something he was proud of. He deserved to be proud of it. The problem was not what Rick Dillard was. The problem was the gap between what he was and what he believed himself to be, and how he managed that gap on nights, when he was away from home and in unfamiliar places, and his student Danny Voss was watching. They had come to Fort Worth on business. Rick was meeting with a sporting goods distributor who might carry his school's branded equipment, and the business had finished at 4 in the afternoon, leaving the evening free in a city that wasn't theirs. They had eaten at a steakhouse. They had walked along the Stockyards district. At some point, Danny had suggested they find a bar and have a drink, and they had ended up at the Lone Star Tavern because it was the 3rd place they passed that looked quiet enough to have a conversation in. Rick Dillard noticed the man in the flannel shirt almost immediately, not because of anything the man did. He was doing nothing, sitting with his iced tea and his stillness, but because Rick Dillard was a trained martial artist, and trained martial artists notice stillness the way other people notice movement. Stillness in a bar, in particular, is unusual. Most people in bars move constantly. They shift on their stools, they reach for their drinks, they scan the room looking for eyes to meet or eyes to avoid. They perform the small, restless theater of social animals establishing themselves in a space. This man wasn't performing anything. He was simply there, in the particular way that very large rocks are there, or very old trees, occupying their space without apology or announcement. Rick sat down 2 stools away and ordered a Lone Star. Danny ordered the same. They talked about the equipment distributor, about the drive, about the students they had back in Abilene and which ones were ready to compete. The jukebox played Merle Haggard. The ceiling fans turned. The neon sign flickered. At some point, Rick would not be able to say exactly when, the way one cannot say exactly when a mood enters a room. He began paying more attention to the man in the flannel shirt. The man had ordered a 2nd iced tea. He was looking at the middle distance above the bar with an expression that was neither happy nor unhappy, neither engaged nor absent. He looked, Rick would later try to explain to himself, like a man who was comfortable with silence in a way that most men are not. Most men are afraid of silence. They fill it. This man had left the silence alone, and the silence was clearly fine with that arrangement. Danny noticed Rick noticing him. Danny Voss was 24 and had his instructor's attention as his primary ambition, and so he had developed considerable skill at reading what Rick noticed. "You think he's a fighter?" Danny said, low enough that only Rick could hear. Rick looked at the man more carefully. The shoulders, even through the flannel shirt, were not the shoulders of someone who had never trained. The forearms resting on the bar were not remarkable in size, but were defined in the way that forearms become defined through years of specific work, the tendons visible under the skin like ropes under canvas. The hands were particular. The knuckles had that certain density that comes from a specific kind of conditioning, from striking things that resist, from years of impact absorbed and redirected. "Maybe," Rick said. Danny said, "Think he's any good?" Rick said, "Doesn't matter." But something in the way he said it suggested it mattered somewhat. Here's what happened next, and here's where the story earns its weight. Nothing dramatic triggered what followed. There was no confrontation, no accidental jostle, no spilled drink, no sideways look that landed wrong. What happened was smaller and more human, and in its smallness, more revealing than any manufactured provocation could have been. Harold Krebs, reaching for a glass on the high shelf behind the bar, knocked a ceramic ashtray off the edge. It fell and shattered on the floor behind the bar with a crash that was surprisingly loud in the contained space of the tavern. Almost everyone in the room flinched or turned. The man in the flannel shirt did not flinch. His eyes moved to the source of the sound in an instant, not in a startled way, but in a precise, calibrated way, the way a compass needle moves to north without drama, without effort, with simple orientation, and then moved back to the middle distance when he had confirmed that the sound was not a threat. The movement took perhaps 3/4 of a second. What was notable was the quality of it. Not the reaction of a nervous man, not the reaction of a man performing alertness, but the reaction of someone whose nervous system had been educated over many years to distinguish between sounds that required response and sounds that did not. Rick Dillard saw this, he processed it, and something in him, the part of him that was still George Dillard's second son, the part that calculated standing and tested things, made a decision that the rest of him would regret within the next 40 minutes. He spoke to the man. "That a trained reaction?" Rick said. The man turned his head, not quickly, not slowly, just turned. He looked at Rick with an expression that was entirely neutral, not cold, not warm, simply present, the way a clear sky is simply present. "Excuse me?" the man said. His voice was medium in pitch, without particular accent, the voice of a man who had lived in multiple places and absorbed none of them completely. It was, Rick would think later, a voice that carried no performance in it whatsoever, no attempt to sound tough or mild or friendly or distant. It was simply a voice communicating words. "The way you tracked the sound," Rick said. "That's trained. You martial arts?" A pause, not a dramatic pause. The man was not performing consideration. He was simply considering. "Some," the man said. Rick nodded, drank his beer, looked at the mirror behind the bar rather than directly at the man, which was a way of continuing a conversation while pretending to be casual about it. "I run a school down in Abilene," Rick said. "Tang Soo Do, 12 years in the art." "Good art," the man said. "Best one," Rick said, with a particular inflection that is not entirely a joke. The man's mouth moved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Might have been. There's an argument for that," the man said. They sat in silence for a moment. Danny Voss, 2 stools down, was watching with the focused attention of a young man who sensed something developing and didn't want to miss it. "What style?" Rick asked. "Started Tang Soo Do," the man said. "Korea, early 60s. Added things along the way." Rick turned and looked at him directly now. "You compete?" "Used to," the man said. "Any titles?" The man looked at Rick for a moment with that same neutral quality, that same simple presence. "Some," he said. Rick Dillard was a good man in the way that most people are good. Not perfectly, not consistently, but genuinely, with actual kindness toward his students and actual loyalty toward his friends, and a real moral code that he tried to live by. What he was about to do was not an expression of his worst self. It was an expression of a particular blind spot that his training, despite its rigor and quality, had not fully addressed. The tendency to calibrate his own standing through comparison, to know himself by measuring against others, to locate his identity, in a hierarchy rather than in a practice. Master Han had tried to correct this in him. The corrections had not fully taken. "I was thinking," Rick said, and here his voice shifted slightly, took on a quality that Danny recognized and that Harold Krebs, who had been tending bar since 1971 and had heard many conversations travel this particular road, also recognized. "We might find a space in the back and do a little sparring. Friendly, just to see." The man in the flannel shirt looked at him. "Just to see what?" the man said. "What you got?" Rick said. "What I got. See where we are." Another pause. Harold Krebs found something to wipe on the far end of the bar. The two brothers from Azle who ran the trucking company glanced at each other. Carl Boudreau at the far end of the bar looked at his beer. "I appreciate the offer," the man said, "but I don't really do that anymore." "Don't spar?" Rick said. "Or don't spar with strangers in bars?" "Second one," the man said. Rick nodded slowly. In his internal narrative, the story he was telling himself about this interaction, he had taken the man's decline as confirmation of something. In Rick Dillard's internal narrative, there were men who declined challenges and men who accepted them, and the men who declined were, in one way or another, explaining something about themselves through the declining. This was a failure of understanding so fundamental that it would take Rick the better part of the next several years to fully dismantle it, but he carried it with him that night as though it were a tool rather than a handicap. "No pressure," Rick said. "Just seemed like you knew something. Seemed like it might be interesting." The man in the flannel shirt was quiet for a moment. He looked at his iced tea. He looked at the longhorn skull above the bar. He looked at Harold Krebs, who had given up pretending to wipe things and was now watching with the frank attention of a man who has seen enough of human nature to be curious about where this particular specimen was headed. Then the man in the flannel shirt said something that Rick Dillard would later try to reconstruct precisely and find that he couldn't quite, that the exact words kept shifting slightly in memory, even as the meaning remained absolutely clear. He said, in that same flat, performanceless voice, "What are you trying to find out?" Rick blinked. "What?" "The sparring," the man said. "What's the question?" "You're trying to answer?" Rick opened his mouth and then closed it. It was a simple question, and it had no simple answer, and the absence of a simple answer was itself an answer of a kind. Danny Voss, on his stool 2 positions down, was very still. "I guess I just want to know where I stand," Rick said finally. The man nodded once. "Okay," he said. He said it not like a man agreeing to a challenge. He said it like a man who had just understood something. The way a doctor says, "Okay," when a symptom finally makes the diagnosis clear. "There's an alley behind the building," Rick said. "We could move around a little, just hands. No one gets hurt." The man looked at him for another moment with those measuring neutral eyes. Then he got off the bar stool, unhurried, and left $3.50 on the bar for Harold Krebs. "All right," he said. What happened in the alley behind the Lone Star Tavern on Camp Bowie Boulevard in Fort Worth, Texas, on the evening of May 14, 1982, was witnessed by 3 people, Rick Dillard, Danny Voss, and a stray dog of indeterminate breed who watched from beneath a dumpster with the incurious patience of an animal that has seen human beings do inexplicable things before and expects to see them again. The alley was lit by a single sodium lamp on a pole at the far end, which gave everything the color of old photographs. There were 2 dumpsters and a stack of collapsed cardboard boxes and a chain-link fence along the back. The pavement was wet from an earlier rain and smelled like concrete and urban earth and something sweet and faintly chemical from the restaurant 2 doors down. Rick Dillard took off his jacket and handed it to Danny. He rolled up his sleeves. He was a good martial artist, not posturing, not performing, genuinely good. And he moved into a fighting stance with the ease of someone who has stood in that geometry 10,000 times. His stance was clean. Feet, shoulder width apart and a half, weight balanced 60-40 rear forward, hands up, elbows in. Master Han Sung-wook's geometry, precise and real. The man in the flannel shirt did not take off his jacket. He did not roll up his sleeves. He stood in the sodium lamplight with his arms at his sides and his weight even, and that quality of stillness that had caught Rick's attention at the bar. That quality that was not relaxation exactly, but something more organized than relaxation. Something that looked like readiness wearing the clothes of rest. Rick waited for the man to assume a stance. The man did not assume a stance. "You're not going to," Rick began. "Ready when you are," the man said. Rick moved. He was not reckless. He was a 12-year practitioner of a serious art, and he came forward with control, a probing combination, front kick into a right reverse punch, not full speed but not slow, the speed of a trained man feeling out an opponent, gathering information. Textbook, Muduk, Quan entry. What happened next took approximately 1.5 seconds, and in those 1.5 seconds, Rick Dillard's understanding of himself, of his art, and of what he did not know underwent the first serious revision it had received in approximately 6 years. The front kick, which was a good kick, Master Han would have approved of it, did not land. The man was no longer where the kick was going. He had not jumped or rolled or executed a dramatic evasion. He had simply, with an economy of movement so severe it was almost offensive, not been there. The displacement was perhaps 8 inches. 8 inches was enough. The reverse punch, coming in behind the kick, found nothing because the kick had found nothing, and the man's body had continued its small movement, a pivot so subtle it was almost invisible, and now he was slightly inside Rick's extended arm and slightly to his left, and his right hand was on Rick's wrist, and his left hand was on Rick's elbow, and there was the most gentle, the most courteous possible application of pressure, and Rick Dillard was on one knee on the wet pavement looking at the sodium lamp. He got up. He stood for a moment, reorganized himself. He was breathing harder than the exchange warranted physically, which meant his nervous system was working harder than his body, which meant something had surprised him at a level deeper than technique. He came again, this time faster, with more commitment, a different combination. He was not a man who repeated himself. A low sweep feint opening into a high back fist, the setup for his best technique, the one that had won him 2 of his 3 regional titles. He executed it well. He executed it as well as he could have executed it, which was genuinely well. The back fist did not land. The man's head was no longer there, not by much, by the minimum necessary and not a fraction more, which was somehow more unsettling than a large evasion would have been, because a large evasion suggests fear or caution, and this was neither. This was precision. This was a man moving the exact amount required and reserving everything else. Then there was a hand on Rick's shoulder and a subtle redirection of his momentum, and Rick was moving in a direction he had not chosen. Not falling, not thrown, simply redirected, the way water is redirected by a stone in a streambed. And when he recovered his balance and turned, around the man was standing where he had been standing, arms at his sides, that same stillness. Danny Voss, by the dumpster, had not moved. He was watching with the expression of a young man whose model of the world is being revised in real time. Rick Dillard breathed. He looked at the man in the flannel shirt. He looked at him the way you look at something when you are setting aside the story you are telling yourself about it, and trying to see it as it actually is. "Who are you?" Rick said. The man's expression did not change, but something in it did. Some very small adjustment, the way the surface of water changes when a stone breaks the surface tension. "Chuck Norris," the man said. Rick Dillard stood very still on the wet pavement of the alley behind the Lone Star Tavern. Here is the thing about hearing a name that rewrites what you thought you knew. It does not feel, in the moment, like revelation. It feels like a room getting very quiet. It feels like the ground beneath your feet confirming its solidity in a way that suggests it had, until that moment, been less solid than you assumed. Rick Dillard had grown up in Texas martial arts. He had sat in Master Hand's dojo and listened to Master Hand talk about the American tournament circuit, the big names of the 1960s and early 1970s, the men who had shaped competitive karate in this country. He had heard the name Chuck Norris from the time he was 17 years old. He had heard it in the context of 6 consecutive world titles, in the context of being one of Bruce Lee's closest friends and training partners, in the context of being, by most serious assessments, one of the finest practitioners of Tang Soo Do in the history of the art's American practice. He had also, in the last 15 minutes, heard it as the name of the quiet man who had been drinking iced tea at the bar and who had just twice, without apparent effort or aggression, made Rick Dillard's best techniques encounter nothing. "The movies," Danny Voss said from by the dumpster, and his voice had the quality of a man doing arithmetic. "Good guys wear black. A force of 1. The octagon. That's..." He stopped. He looked at the man in the flannel shirt. He said very quietly, "Oh." Chuck Norris looked at Danny Voss with the same neutral, present attention he had given everything else this evening. He said mildly, "Hi." Rick Dillard lowered his hands. He had not realized he had raised them again. He lowered them now, slowly, and there was something in the lowering that went beyond the physical gesture. There was a lowering of other things, beside hands. "I didn't know," Rick said. "I know you didn't," Chuck Norris said. "It's okay." "It's not, Rick stopped, started again. "That was embarrassing?" "No," Chuck said. "It wasn't." Rick looked at him. "You threw 2 good combinations," Chuck said. "Clean mechanics. Master Han taught you well." Rick blinked. "You know Master Han?" "Han Sung-wook, Abilene?" Chuck's expression shifted slightly in that direction that might be a smile. "I competed against 2 of his students in Dallas, 1969. Good school. He runs a tight ship." The world in which Rick Dillard had been living, which had been reorganizing itself for the past several minutes, now completed a significant restructuring. He was standing in an alley in Fort Worth, Texas, being told by Chuck Norris that his teacher ran a tight ship. This was not a circumstance he had anticipated when he woke up that morning in Abilene. "I challenged you," Rick said, "in the bar." "You did," Chuck said. "You didn't have to take me up on it." Chuck was quiet for a moment. He looked up at the sodium lamp, then back at Rick. When he spoke, his voice carried that same quality it had carried all evening. No performance, no judgment, no attempt to manage how it would land. "You were trying to find out where you stand," he said. "I understand that. I spent a lot of years trying to find that out myself." Rick looked at him. And it's the wrong question," Chuck said. "Eventually." The stray dog beneath the dumpster shifted and resettled. Somewhere down Camp Bowie Boulevard, a car horn sounded twice. The sodium lamp cast its old photograph light across the wet pavement and the three men standing on it. "How do you mean?" Rick said. Chuck Norris looked at him with an attention that Rick would remember for the rest of his life, not because it was intimidating, not because it was impressive, but because it was simply, completely, without qualification, real. He was looking at Rick the way you look at something when you're actually interested in it, when you're not managing it or measuring it or using it to confirm what you already believe, but are simply receiving it as it is. "Where you stand," Chuck said. "It changes every day. You could beat me today and I could beat you tomorrow. I could have beaten guys who beat me, and they could have beaten guys who beat them. The ranking, the title, it tells you something, but it tells you less than you think it does. What doesn't change is what you built, what you gave to it in the years when nobody was watching." He paused. "You've been teaching for how long?" 3 years, Rick said. "The school." "How many students?" 30, give or take. Chuck nodded. "That's more than most titles." Rick Dillard stood on the wet pavement of the alley and felt something he would, later, trying to articulate it to his wife back in Abilene, describe as the ground shifting but staying solid. Not the ground giving way, the ground becoming more real. "I was going to prove something tonight," Rick said. It cost him something to say it. "To Danny, to myself, coming up to you like that." "I know," Chuck said. "That's not what the art is for." "No," Chuck said, "but we all go through that, some for longer than others." He looked at Rick with that direct, quiet attention. "The fact that you know it's wrong means you're further along than you think." They stood in the alley for another few minutes, and in those minutes, something happened that was different from what had happened before. They talked, not about rank or titles or who had beaten whom. They talked about Master Han's school, which Chuck had genuine respect for. They talked about training, about the particular difficulty of maintaining the original spirit of an art while adapting it to competitive formats that rewarded different things. They talked about students. Chuck mentioned some of his from the schools he had run in the 1960s and early 1970s before the film career had consumed the teaching time. He talked about them the way you talk about something that mattered, with a specificity that comes from actual attention. Danny Voss listened from by the dumpster. He did not speak. He was doing something more valuable. He was watching a version of Rick Dillard that he had not seen before. A Rick who was not performing certainty, not managing his standing, not using the conversation to establish a position, and he was filing it away in the part of his memory where the things that actually changed him lived. At some point, 10:23 p.m., though none of them were checking the time, Chuck Norris said he should get back inside. He had an early drive the next morning. He shook Rick's hand. He shook Danny's. Hand. He told Rick, in that same flat, unperformative voice, that his school sounded like something worth being proud of. "You really think so?" Rick said. And the question was so unguarded, so genuinely uncertain, so thoroughly stripped of the armor he had been wearing all evening, that it surprised even him. Chuck looked at him. "Yeah," he said, "I really do." He went back inside. Through the window, Rick and Danny could see him settle back onto his bar stool, pick up his iced tea, and resume his relation with the middle distance above the bar, that settled, rootless stillness, as though nothing had happened in the alley. As though the alley had been a small parenthesis in an ongoing sentence, and the sentence had resumed. Harold Krebs, who had been watching the whole thing through the back window with his arms folded across his chest, Harold had been tending bar since 1971 and had witnessed approximately 9 serious fights in the Lone Star Tavern's history, plus an uncounted number of near fights, most of which he had diffused by the simple expedient of setting a fresh beer down in front of the right person at the right moment, the bartender's version of diplomacy, had watched this particular exchange with an attention different in character from the attention he brought to those past 9 fights. Those 9 fights had been loud, clumsy, fueled by alcohol and specific grievances, and the particular masculine physics of enclosed spaces and too little sleep. This thing in the alley had been quiet. It had been fast. It had been, Harold Krebs thought, watching through the window with his arms crossed, the most efficient argument he had ever witnessed. The kind of argument where one party presents evidence that is so conclusive that the other party has nothing to do but receive it. He went back to wiping glasses. Carl Boudreau, at the far end of the bar, hadn't moved. The jukebox had moved on from Merle Haggard to Willie Nelson. The neon sign flickered. Rick Dillard stood in the alley for a moment after Chuck had gone back inside. He picked up his jacket from where Danny had set it on the dumpster. He put it on. He looked at the sodium lamp and at the wet pavement and at the chain-link fence and at the stray dog who was still watching him from beneath the dumpster with those ancient, patient eyes. "Don't say anything," Rick said to Danny. "I wasn't going to," Danny said. They stood there a moment. Longer. "Master Han always said that about the question," Rick said. "About where you stand? He said it was the wrong question." "I know," Danny said. "You told me. I didn't understand it when he said it." Danny nodded. He was 24 and he was smart enough to know when not to speak. They went back inside and finished their beers. Chuck Norris was still at the bar. He didn't look at them when they came back in. Not because he was ignoring them. There was nothing pointed or deliberate in it. He simply had returned to wherever he had been before, that interior place that the stillness pointed to, that quality of being completely present in oneself rather than in the room. And the room was welcome to exist around it. Rick Dillard and Danny Voss left the Lone Star Tavern at 10:51 p.m. They drove back to their motel on the interstate. Neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes of the drive. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall around 11:15, soft and steady and Texan, the kind of rain that doesn't apologize for arriving late. At the motel, in the parking lot, Danny said, "He was just drinking iced tea." "Yeah," Rick said, "the whole time, just sitting there." "Yeah. And you went up to him?" Rick looked at his student. Danny's face in the rain-diffused parking lot light was young and complicated, trying to find the tone appropriate to what he had just witnessed, trying to figure out if his instructor needed sympathy or solidarity or something else entirely. "Go to bed, Danny," Rick said. Not unkindly. Danny went to bed. Rick Dillard sat in his car for a while. The rain fell on the windshield and ran down in rivulets, and the motel parking lot glittered with it. He sat with what had happened, not analyzing it, not constructing a narrative around it, just sitting with it the way you sit with something when you are willing to let it be what it is, rather than what you need it to be. He thought about 12 years of training. He thought about 30 students in Abilene who were depending on him to understand what he was teaching them. He thought about his own teacher, Master Han Sung-wook, who had told him years ago that the hardest opponent any martial artist faces is not across the ring, but inside himself. The opponent made of ego, of the need to be seen, of the fear beneath the confidence. He had nodded when Master Han said it. He had filed it away, in the category of wise things that other people needed to hear. He thought about 8 inches of displacement and a hand on his shoulder, and the sensation of his momentum going somewhere it had not chosen to go. He thought about Chuck Norris saying, "That's more than most titles." He did not sleep particularly well that night, not because he was upset. By the time he lay down, he was past upset, but because he was awake in a different way than usual, the way you are awake after a thing that has rearranged something. The familiar interior landscape looked subtly different from inside a reorganized self. He drove back to Abilene the next morning. Danny was quiet in the passenger seat for most of the drive, which was unusual for Danny, and Rick understood it as its own kind of respect. The respect that a young person pays to a process they can see happening in their teacher, but cannot yet name. They got back to Abilene by early afternoon. Rick went directly to the school. He didn't go home first. He changed into his training clothes and he went to the floor and he practiced alone for 2 hours. Not competition techniques, not the flashy combinations he used in tournaments, but the basics, the fundamental forms, the things Master Han had taught him when he was 17 and new to the art and had nothing to prove because he didn't yet know what proving things meant. He moved through the forms in the empty school in the early afternoon light, coming through the high windows, and he thought about what Chuck Norris had said about what doesn't change, about what you built, about what you gave to it in the years when nobody was watching. He thought, I am a teacher. I have 30 students who trust me with something real. That's what I am. That's the ground I stand on. It was a thought he had had before, technically. But it is the difference between thinking a thing and knowing it, and he had not known it before. Not with the solidity it had now, not with the weight of a wet alley in Fort Worth and a quiet man's hand on his shoulder. He taught his evening class at 6. He was better than usual. Not more energetic, not more dramatic, but more real, more present, less concerned with demonstrating mastery and more concerned with actually transmitting it. Danny Voss trained in that class and noticed the difference. He would not say anything about it for several weeks, and when he did say something, he would say it simply. You were different after Fort Worth. Rick would say, I know. What Danny Voss noticed, and he was a perceptive young man, perceptive in the particular way that people become perceptive when they have spent 4 years watching a teacher very carefully, was not that Rick was more technical or more demanding or more physically impressive. Danny had watched Rick Norris work with Chuck Norris in that alley, and had seen, in about 45 seconds, that there were levels of technical precision above Rick Dillard's that Rick Dillard had not previously confronted. That was the surface fact. The deeper fact, the one Danny noticed in the class on the Saturday after they returned, was that Rick had stopped concerning himself with demonstrating mastery. He had always been a good teacher. He had always been generous with his attention and honest with his corrections. But there had been, underneath the teaching, something that Danny could feel but had not previously been able to name, a faint performance quality, a faint sense that the teaching was also a demonstration of the teacher's standing, that the relationship between instructor and student was organized not only around the student's development, but also around the confirmation of the instructor's expertise. After Fort Worth, that layer was gone, or rather, it was thinner, much thinner. What remained was the teaching itself, the genuine transmission of something real from someone who had it to people who needed it. The small ego charge that had been running underneath the instruction had been, not extinguished exactly, but quieted, put in its place, reminded of its place. Danny Voss trained under Rick Dillard for 3 more years after that Saturday class. He received, in those 3 years, instruction that he would later, opening his own school in Lubbock in 1988, describe to his own students as the best martial arts teaching he had ever received. Not because of what it contained, technically, but because of what it was oriented toward. It was oriented toward the student, completely, without the faint counterweight of the teacher's need to be seen. He never mentioned Chuck Norris to his students. It would have been the wrong story to tell. It would have turned an inward thing into an outward thing, which would have been a betrayal of what had happened. The story wasn't about Chuck Norris. The story was about a question Rick Dillard had been asking in the wrong direction for years, and one evening when it had finally come back to him from the outside, it had come back as the right question. Not where do I stand, but what am I standing on? He drove back to Abilene, and in the days that followed, in the week and the month and the years, he worked on the thing that the alley had shown him needed working on. Not his technique. His technique was sound. Master Han had made sure of that over 12 years of exacting. Instruction. What he worked on was the reason for the technique, the purpose for which the art was being held. There is a difference between a martial artist who trains in order to be capable and a martial artist who trains in order to be validated. And the difference is not visible in the techniques themselves. The kicks and the blocks and the forms look the same from outside, are executed with the same physical precision. The difference lives in something prior to the techniques, in the question that drives the training, the reason a person returns to the floor every morning. Rick Dillard had been training for validation in the way that most people who have never been explicitly asked that question trained for validation, not consciously, not with the awareness of doing so, but structurally, in the way that the habit was organized and the success was measured and the challenges were interpreted. The question was always, at some level, the question Chuck Norris had named in the alley, where do I stand? And the standing was always in relation to other people, other schools, other teachers, other fighters, the regional circuit, the imagined hierarchy. What had changed in the alley was not a revelation exactly. It was not the sudden appearance of new information. It was the removal of an obstruction that had been preventing information that was already present from arriving. Master Han had given Rick the information. He had been giving it to him. For 12 years. The work is the work. The students are the purpose. The art is the art. The floor is what you stand on, and you built it, and it is real regardless of who knows about it or how it compares. All of this was already there, in everything Master Han had ever taught him. But Rick Dillard had been standing in front of it, the way you can stand in front of a window and not see what's outside because you're looking at your own reflection. The alley had moved him slightly. Just slightly. Enough that he stopped looking at the reflection and started looking through the glass. He continued teaching in Abilene for another 17 years. In that time, the school grew from 30 students to over 100. 3 of his students competed at national level. One of them, a young woman named Teresa Garza, who joined the school in 1985 at the age of 14, would eventually win a regional championship in 1992 and go on to open her own school in San Antonio, where she still teaches. In the lineage of her school, in the philosophy she brings to her teaching, there is something that traces back through Rick Dillard to Master Han Sung-wook, and in its deep structure, in the particular way it treats the question of where you stand, there is an 8-inch displacement in a Fort Worth alley, and the quiet certainty of a man who had long since found his answer. Master Han Sung-wook, when Rick returned to visit him in 1985 and told him the story, not all of it, but enough, looked at his former student for a long moment and then nodded once with the slow gravity of a man whose patience has finally been rewarded. "I told you," Master Han said. "I know," Rick said. "I told you many times." "I know," Rick said again. "But some things you have to hear from someone else." Master Han considered this. Chuck Norris, he said, in a tone that acknowledged the particular weight of the name in their shared world. He was drinking iced tea, Rick said. Masterhand's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was the predecessor of one. Of course he was, he said. Chuck Norris, for his part, drove to San Antonio the next morning as planned. He had a meeting about a film project that would eventually become one of his better-known features. He did not mention the evening at the Lone Star Tavern to anyone. It had not been an event, in his understanding. It had been an encounter, the kind of low-temperature, high-density exchange that happens when the right two people meet in the right unguarded moment and both of them are paying attention. He had been having them his whole adult life, on floors and in gyms and in alleys and in hotel lobbies after tournaments, the small unscripted moments that the training had produced and that no camera had ever captured. He knew the man's name was Rick because he had introduced himself in the bar. He did not know the school in Abilene. He did not know about Danny Voss or Teresa Garza or the 17 years of teaching that followed or the school in San Antonio. He would never know. The stone he had thrown landed in water he could not see, and the circles spread outward in a silence that required no witness. He arrived in San Antonio in the early afternoon. He checked into his hotel. He ordered iced tea from room service and sat by the window looking at the city for a while, thinking about the film project and the people he was going to meet and the things that needed to happen in a specific order over the next several months. He was thinking about the future. He had a habit of thinking about the future while feeling the present very fully, which is perhaps the most accurate definition of what the martial arts had given him. Not a technique, not a title, not a reputation, but the capacity to inhabit 2 time zones simultaneously and be fully at home in both. Outside his window, San Antonio spread in the afternoon sun, indifferent and beautiful and going on about its business. The iced tea was good. He drank it. He sat. He was still. Fort Worth, Texas, May 1982.